This is a mason jar with some natural dye that I made out of yellow yarrow flowers that grew in my backyard. This is my first time trying to make natural dye, and I've been using this book, A Garden to Dye For, as a reference. It's not very scientific. It's more of an inspirational overview. It actually is quite comprehensive, though, from my perspective as someone just starting to learn about making natural dye, but it's not overly prescriptive. So there's room for experimentation, but also margin for error. I did a quick dip test with laser paper and watercolor paper, and unfortunately, you basically cannot tell they were dipped. There's maybe some slight yellow cast to the bottom parts of the paper, maybe more visible on one side than the other. I soaked another piece of laser paper and watercolor paper in the jar and let that sit for a couple of hours. That test does suggest that longer exposure to the dye, even without a mordant, does deposit more color. This inserted picture was taken 2 weeks after the 2-hour dip, and although they've been protected from daylight, I'm glad to see the color does seem to have held onto the paper pretty well. My understanding is that animal fibers like wool take natural dyes much better than plant fibers, such as cotton-based textiles or, of course, tree-based paper. So for my next experiment, I will try working with some sort of mordant to see how that impacts the time for the color to set and its ability to last, its color fastness. As for my process with this first experiment, I just clipped some flowers, put them in a pot of water, brought it to a simmer, turned it off, let it steep in the warm water in the pot with the lid on for a couple of hours. Then I transferred the liquid as well as the flowers to this mason jar, and it's just been sitting on my shelf for a couple of weeks. However this process turns out, however my own experiments go, I've been really happy to find this book. It's a really great little reference and inspiration to just kind of generally introduce the process of making and working with natural dyes. There are some very helpful kind of warnings and disclaimers up in the front. There are a lot of colorful pictures. There's a great overview of what a mordant is and how it helps natural dyes to stick better to different types of media. There are setup instructions. And then, of course, there are descriptions of different types of plants you can try working with. And it's not all things that grow in the garden. It also includes food-based dye agents like beets and turmeric and other things like that. So it's been an interesting experimental process so far, even if there's not so much to show for it, but I'm really glad to share this early experimentation, and I'm really glad to have this book as a reference through this process. A Garden to Dye For.